So I'm going to talk about the stressed brain. Oh, there are more people up there. Hi. Do you hear me well? Thank you. So I'm going to talk about the stressed brain and about the way we try to understand the stressed brain. Normally, when we talk about or think about stress, we think about something negative. We think about the aversive effects of stress, and we tend to forget that the stress response actually developed in order to help us manage challenges in life, to help us respond in the right way for the challenges, and also to learn from that and to evolve better behaviors for the next time we will be encountering a similar experience. So the stress response is not a bad thing. It's actually, it should be a good thing. And in fact, we tend to think of the stress response in line of this graph where too low stress is not good for us either, because stress at a reasonable level actually motivates us to, I think this is too strong, to do things, to function. And in fact, when we have an increase in the level of stress, but still in the normal level of stress, we normally are more focused in our target, in our aim, and we perform better. So a little level of stress is actually important in our life. The problem is that if it goes beyond that level, then it starts to be interrupting up to the point where it can lead to really development of diseases. When you hear about stress, we normally hear a very simplified version of what is stress. When we talk about animals, we normally tend to describe this freezing response or a fight or flight response. And when we talk about humans, we talk about a stressor that activates the sympathetic response and the endocrine response of stress, and we have a response to stress. This is a very simplified way of referring to this stress response, and if we would stay with this, it would be difficult for us to try and learn how to work with stress, because stress is a much more complicated and coordinated response. You have to think of stress in terms of war, in a way, because the immediate response to a stress is to try and recruit all of your resources towards facing this threat in a way that hopefully would solve the problem fairly quickly. And then you could continue and go on with your life. And then you see this response of freezing or fighting or fleeing from the scene in order to quickly, and we talk about minutes when we talk about quickly, that could solve the problem. But if the stress or the threat continues for a longer time, then we have to shift to a kind of a response that fits better a longer term response. Because we need to respond, so we need to have the ability to physically respond to the stress, but we also need to maintain the ability of the body to respond. So there's a kind of a rebalancing of the resources towards physically being able to respond and building up those functions that are important for maintaining our ability to respond at the expense of other processes that normally take place in our body, building up the body, healing, etc. And then, after this event is over, there's a third phase which is very important, and this is rebuilding. This is recovering from the stress response, or from the cost of the response to the threat. So, the response to stress is a very well coordinated response, which is very well suited. It developed over evolution to be very well suitable for responding to stressors of the kind that our ancestors have faced, like running away from tigers. Okay? But I don't know if any of you had the experience of running away from a tiger. I remember as a child, one time I ran away from a bull, but this is because I did not understand what I should not do with the bull. But we face other problems, like we used to be running after the food and having shortage of food most of the time. And now we are eating too much and having too much availability of food in most of the places. And we moved from being a very small community of people living together to communities of tens, hundreds of thousands, and even millions living together. And we moved from having real friendship with people to having kind of a Facebook friendship. And this leads us to having a stress system that is very suitable to our life thousands of years ago, but not so much suitable for the kind of life we're living today. And the result is that we are facing daily stressors that our system is not perfectly equipped to deal with. And we have those stressors repeatedly. They may not be very traumatic, but they continue. And in modern life, unfortunately, we have many reasons and causes to also experience some real traumatic experiences. And not few people experience, at least once in their life, a very traumatic experience. And repeated stressors and traumatic experiences certainly can lead to different types of diseases, and in particular to psychiatric and mental illnesses. And this is not a small story. Even if you do not go into the numbers exactly, the portion of mental disorders is the largest, by large, the largest portion of the source of suffering for humans around the world. This is in comparison to other types of diseases. You can see that mental illnesses are the heaviest load. So we try to understand the mechanisms of the response to stress related to modern life, with the hope, of course, that this would lead to better understanding of the mechanisms, and so to the ability to develop better ways of coping with, treating diseases associated with stress. And stress affects all of our body and all of the systems in our body, but it, of course, mainly involves the effects on the brain, and it is the effects on the brain that lead to mental diseases. So we want to try and understand the brain. So let me do a diversion and talk a little bit about how do we study the brain. First of all, as some of you have already told me that they recognize, it is our tendency at every period of our history to associate the function of the brain to the technologies that are available at that time. And now we are in the era of computers, so we try to think of our brain as a kind of a computer. But the truth is that our brain is not a computer. I mean, it computes, but it's not a computer, and the technology it uses is very different from computers and is very complex. Is the most complex organ we have to study in our body. And while in previous periods of research, we had very limited tools to try and study the brain, in the last few tens of years, we have improved a lot in terms of the tools we have to study the brain. And one of the directions is the development of different techniques for imaging the brain, like fMRI and PET. These are techniques that enable us to see the structure of the brain in quite accurate details in living people. And when we move to functional imaging, we can see the working of the brain in quite great detail. The hot spots are areas of the brain that are active during a certain activity. And this enables us to ask questions about the healthy brain. For example, the brain in love. This is a study where they try to compare maternal love and romantic love. And of course, it helps us to look at the brain of different pathologies. You have here Alzheimer's disease. You have here looking at the brain of depressed persons or post-traumatic stress disorder. And you can see the differences quite clearly. So this has opened the way to a new wave of studies about how the brain works. But these methods, although they give us a lot of very important new information, have their limitations because they talk about brain areas that function. And when I want to irritate my colleagues who work with brain imaging techniques, I like to show them this slide, because talking about a region in the brain, talking to another region in the brain, is a bit like talking about Haifa, speaking with Valparaíso, while I'm talking on the phone with someone in Valparaíso from Haifa. Clearly, if I'm talking with someone from Haifa to Valparaíso, there is some communication between the two regions. But saying that there is some communication between the two regions gives us very little information about what the conversation we had is about. And in order to go beyond the level of regions, in order to go really to the mechanisms, we need to dive into the brain. We need to try and look at the cells, the neurons, the synapses, which are the connections between neurons, and how they function. And this is far more difficult and far more limited to do in humans. By the way, this is a good thing, that it is limited. But in terms of research, it is a limitation. And so we turn to using the concept of evolution brought to us by Charles Darwin, with the idea that we are here as a result of evolvement from some ancestors. Some of them are similar or are joined to other animals that are around us. So we did not directly evolve from chimpanzees, but we and the chimpanzees had some common ancestor, and so we share still many common mechanisms and systems. So we can study the systems in the animals, and they would reflect on the systems in the humans. And of course, how far can you go in the evolutionary ladder depends on your question. Sometimes it can go quite far. For example, if you want to understand how the genes work, you can go quite far. In fact, single cells have genes that function very similar to what we have. And the great breakthroughs in genetic engineering in animals started with this annoying fruit fly that we try to send away from our food. This was the animal of study, and it led to the dolly ship that was duplicated, and to the theoretical ability of duplicating people with all the ethical issues associated with that. And this is Eric Kandel, a Nobel Prize laureate who received the Nobel Prize in 2001, if I remember, on mechanisms of learning and memory. All his study was done at the level of the sea slug, Aplysia, but working on single cells. And the way single cells function in this creature are very similar to single cells in our brain. However, when you start to think of psychological aspects, mental illnesses, these nerve systems of the sea slug are too simplified, too far away from what we need to study. And we need to have a brain that is much more similar to our brain, a mammalian brain. And for that, a slide went wrong, but the idea is that the animal that stood forward and is used mainly to study is a rat or a mouse. We know a lot about rats and mice. Actually, almost 95% of medical studies are done on rats and mice. Probably this is the reason why we have so many rats and mice around us, because we can treat them. But using animals to study about us, when you think about things like the comparison of the limbs or the coloring of the skin or of the fly, it's very easy to think about how evolution led these changes to be. But when we start to think about emotions, how much emotions do you have in a sea slug, or how much emotions do you have in a rat? It's a bit of a different question. And surprisingly, the same person who brought to us the evolution, Charles Darwin, who wrote the famous book, The Origin of the Species, wrote another book. But you know, if you're a successful writer and you have a very successful book, you have a problem when you publish another book. It gets less attention. That's what happened to him. He wrote a book, The Expression of Emotions in Men and Animals. And it was in 1872 that it was published, showing that just like humans have emotional responses, animals have emotional responses as well. And anyone who has a pet animal knows that, actually. And this idea that evolved led us to understand that this rat that runs away from the cat has the emotional response of fear. It may not be as aware as we are to the fact that it is afraid, but it has the full response of fear. And it turned out, over years of research, that the system, the brain system responsible for the fear response, is very similar between rats, monkeys, and humans, mainly involving these three areas: the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. And this led the way to the idea that we could develop animal models of different aspects of our behavior of psychology and of psychiatry. And these models are supposed to help us to find better treatments to different psychiatric disorders. This is the idea behind these models. However, if you now look back to something like 50 years of research using animal models in psychiatry, it is unfortunate to say that development progress has not been as remarkable as we were hoping for. If you compare it to developments in other fields of medicine using animal models, this is one example, and regardless of what it means that the light blue or the purple is regular medicine, and you see there's a lot of progress, and the others are psychiatric disorders, schizophrenia and depression, and there's no progress. And this is a big issue. It's a bigger issue than you may estimate, because this result led all of the major pharmaceutical companies to move away from trying to develop drugs for mental disorders. This means that if I would give this talk 50 years from now, I could still use this slide if we do not change something. I'm going to try and change something. So let me take the example of post-traumatic stress disorder and to show you how we try to think what is wrong and how can we make it better. And as many people say, God is in the detail. When we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, we talk about an exposure to a very traumatic experience. And this has led to the thought that the traumatic experience induces post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay? The problem with that is that, in fact, and this is a well-known fact, most people who are exposed to traumatic experiences actually do not develop PTSD. We talk about maybe 10% of people who are exposed to horrible experiences. 10% maybe develop PTSD. By the way, this is good news also. But this led to a type of animal models of PTSD that is still used in many laboratories today, although this is changing now. The idea is that you take a group of animals that were not exposed to a trauma, and you compare it to a group of animals that were exposed to the trauma, and you compare them. And it looks very reasonable. It looks like the right thing to do, except, let me give you an example for how this is inaccurate. Think about two groups of soldiers, let's say American soldiers in Afghanistan. They patrol areas in different places in Afghanistan, and at one time, one group is exposed to a traumatic event. You would expect that if you would come half a year later and measure symptoms of PTSD, you would have higher symptoms in the group that was exposed. And probably this is what you will find. So that the average symptoms in group B that was exposed is higher than that of group A that was not exposed. This is how they work also with the animal models. And if you have statistical significance and you can write paper about it, you are very happy. Only that we all know that this is not really the way the results look like. They look more like this. As we said, only part of the people in group B would actually develop PTSD or PTSD symptoms. And it seemed to us much more relevant and interesting to compare those individuals in group B that were exposed to the trauma and developed PTSD to those that were exposed to the trauma and did not develop PTSD. rather than comparing the average of group A to group B. And the question we ask ourselves, we know this is the case in humans, can we translate that to the animal models? Can we go to a group of animals and identify those animals that are actually affected and dissociate those from those that were exposed to the same experience but did not develop the symptoms? And I wouldn't have told you this if I had not developed a way. So we developed a way. I would not go in much great detail to how we do it. I can tell you that it is now accepted. It has not been easy, but it is now accepted by the scientific community. And we actually analyze their behavior, referring to a variety of parameters. And then we can identify those animals that are affected from those animals that are not affected, which is fantastic because now we can study the affected brain really. We can focus on those animals that are really affected. It is fantastic in another way, which we actually, I must admit, did not anticipate but benefited from, because once you identify the affected animals, you also identify the unaffected animals, the resilience, the animals that actually were exposed but were not affected. And we can now talk about an affected brain and a resilient brain. And it just so happened that resilience has become now a trendy topic to study. So we are well in place for these studies as well. But as I told my students, particularly at the time that we were publishing the behavioral results and getting some criticism from the scientific community, that the proof is in the brain. We need to show that our definition of affected animal shows in the brain should be different from the brain of people, also of people, by the way, of animals that are not affected. And we went into a study where we measured this. We measured activity in different brain areas. And again, without going into the details, the upper layer is the result of brains from animals that have been exposed to the same trauma but did not develop PTSD symptoms, and the lower plane of animals that has been exposed and developed the symptoms. And you don't need much statistics to see that these are very different maps of activity, which proves our concept of dividing the animals. And I want to demonstrate to you with one more experiment how important this division could be to our understanding of the brain. So let me take one example of an experiment we did, where we came back to an experiment we did before we started to do this kind of behavioral profiling. And we found in that previous experiment that there is a change in one molecule in the brain. And we thought this change in the one molecule is very important and probably relevant to the pathology. And we decided to come back to this now with this new approach. So this is the experiment. We had 3 groups. A group of controls, which were not exposed. A group that was exposed to the trauma only in adulthood, which leads to very mild effects. As I told you, you expect actually only 10% or something of the animals to be affected. And a group that was exposed to the same trauma in adulthood, but on the background of a very important risk factor, and this is adversities in their childhood. These animals, this childhood plus adulthood experience, this is the group that shows the highest symptoms. And it is in this group that we found previously the elevation of that molecule. And we repeated this result. What you see in the black lines is the elevation of that molecule called alpha-1. And you can see that it is very systematic in different brain areas. And if you see such a result, the interpretation would be, this is an elevation of this molecule in the brain of animals that showed very high symptoms, so this is bad. The elevation of this alpha-1 is bad. We need to find a way to reduce the expression of alpha-1 in order to help these animals. Okay? Only that we did not stop here. We now took this group and we divided them to those that were affected and those that were not affected. Okay? And to our surprise, all of the elevation in expression of that alpha-1 was in the animals that were exposed to the trauma but actually did not develop the symptoms, and not in the animals with the high symptoms. This means exactly the opposite conclusion of what we said before, looking at the average of the group. This means that, in fact, the elevation of alpha-1 may somehow be associated with resilience, with the ability of these animals to go through a very traumatic experience and to be able to pass it in a good way. One type of difference, individual difference, is whether you're a man or a woman. And they claim that there are differences between men and women in terms of sensitivity to PTSD. Women actually are supposed to be more sensitive and develop higher levels of PTSD than men. But the truth is that this actually depends on the way you define PTSD. If you define PTSD in a way that is more suitable to describe the pathology in women and not so suitable to describe the pathology in men, you will get more women falling into the category of PTSD, whereas men would be falling to other categories like alcoholism, aggression, etc. This difference in the prevalence of the disease are followed also by differences in the type of symptoms that men and women complain about. And this may lead, as I said, to a difference in the diagnosis. And I want to show you an example in the animal model, because I want to kind of demonstrate to you that these animal models can be sensitive if you work with them in the right way. So what we did was to try and compare results for male and female rats. And what we found was, to your right are females and to the left are males, and you can see that males are very much affected and females are not affected. Okay? By the test that we used. Never mind what the test is. If we were running only this, we would come to the conclusion that either the description in humans is wrong or that the model is wrong, because we get more males that are affected. But if we tested in a different test, using a different readout, looking at different symptoms, we found that males were not affected. Females were significantly affected. If we would only use this one, we would come to the conclusion that only females are sensitive. Men are not sensitive, which we know is not true. And we did find some symptoms that could be seen to be affected both in males and females. So what we did was to kind of aggregate those into a joint index, like actually a psychiatrist is doing. A psychiatrist sees a patient, asks him questions, talks about different aspects of life, and then decides, with this cluster of symptoms that are described to him, that this person suffers from PTSD, and another person suffers from PTSD, despite the fact that the cluster of symptoms may not be completely similar. Because in patients, we have variability in depression, in PTSD, in anxiety disorders. So we defined a kind of a diagnosis tool for males and a diagnosis tool for females. And we found that both males and females were affected in a similar way, to a similar level, but having different symptoms. Which means that for animals, for sure, we need to use different criteria to define the pathology for males and females. I remind you, these are individual differences. And I actually think that also for humans, we need to develop separate sets of criteria for men and women. So what I was trying to tell you is that if we will continue in this direction, and this is just, I remind you, this is just one aspect that I emphasized here. There are many small aspects like that that could be improved. But if we refer to detecting individual differences, will enable us to lead to much more personalized type of medicine, so that each person would get the treatment that is effective for him. And we should realize that nowadays there is no effective treatment for stress-related disorders. Not for post-traumatic stress disorder, not so much for depression, not so much for anxiety, etc. But we believe that we are heading in the right direction, that we have started with new concepts and new ways of looking at the mechanisms of stress that would lead to a significant progress in the coming years. So I want to finish here. Thank you for your patience. And this is Haifa. You are invited to come and visit. It's beautiful. Thank you very much.